Mark had everything anyone could ever wish for: a promising career, influential friends, and impeccable looks. But he harbored a secret no one could ever imagine, a secret that would change his life forever. What could drive such a successful man to hide his own wife? Was it shame, fear, or something even deeper? This is the story of Mark and Jane, a tale of love, prejudice, and redemption. Get ready for an emotional journey that will surprise you at every turn, because what seemed like a marriage shrouded in silence revealed an ending no one could have ever predicted. Mark had always been seen as the perfect man, tall, with refined features and a smile that could charm anyone. He was admired by colleagues and envied by acquaintances. His success in the corporate world was a testament to his determination to achieve his goals. But behind the polished exterior of his professional life, Mark carried a secret that was both his greatest blessing and his deepest struggle: Jane. Mark first met Jane on what had seemed like an ordinary day. He was leaving a coffee shop, balancing his phone and papers in one hand, when he noticed her. She was struggling to hold a large book and a torn shopping bag while trying to keep her balance on the uneven sidewalk. Something about her vulnerability and determination caught his attention. Without hesitation, Mark walked over to help. Jane, on the other hand, remembered that day vividly as one of the worst of her life, until she met Mark. Everything had gone wrong, from errands to work deadlines. Then, out of nowhere, this stranger appeared, offering her help with a kindness she wasn't accustomed to. Jane had spent much of her life feeling judged. Always a bit overweight, she had endured cruel nicknames and hurtful comments during her school years. She had tried countless diets and trends, each one leaving her more exhausted than the last. Over time, she began to realize that her worth wasn't defined by a number on a scale or by other people's opinions. Learning to look in the mirror and appreciate her own reflection was a hard-won victory. By the time she met Mark, Jane had built a foundation of confidence. She still worried about her health and tried to maintain a balanced lifestyle, but she refused to let her insecurities dictate her life. She embraced her intelligence, creativity, and humor, knowing these traits mattered far more than her appearance. Mark saw these qualities immediately and was captivated. Jane's authenticity and warmth quickly became a source of light in Mark's otherwise rigid world. He admired her ability to turn mundane moments into something special, whether it was cracking jokes during a grocery run or passionately discussing her latest baking experiment. Jane lived unapologetically, and that freedom mesmerized Mark. But while Jane radiated confidence, Mark struggled with the pressures of his upbringing and social circle. He had grown up surrounded by people who valued appearance and status above all else. His friends and colleagues, accustomed to rigid beauty standards, often judged others by superficial criteria. Mark hated this mindset, but found himself influenced by it in ways he didn't fully understand. Mark's fear of judgment became a quiet undercurrent in their relationship. Although he adored Jane's vibrancy and authenticity, he couldn't silence the voice in his head that warned him about how others might perceive her. This internal conflict grew stronger as their relationship deepened. When Mark proposed to Jane, he planned a small and intimate ceremony. Jane didn't question his preference for privacy. She loved the idea of a simple celebration that focused solely on their love. She had no reason to suspect that Mark's choice was rooted in fear rather than romance. The day of their wedding was filled with joy. Jane wore a simple, elegant dress that matched her natural beauty, and Mark couldn't take his eyes off her. Yet, beneath his smiles, he felt a pang of anxiety. He looked at Jane, the love of his life, and silently wondered why he couldn't embrace their relationship fully without fear of outside judgment. In the months following their wedding, Jane poured herself into their new home, turning it into a space that reflected their shared life. She added small, thoughtful touches to every corner, creating an atmosphere of comfort and warmth. Mark cherished these efforts and found solace in their quiet moments together, but the distance between his internal worlds, home and the outside world, grew wider. Jane noticed small inconsistencies in Mark's behavior over time. He avoided taking her to work events, always offering plausible reasons. The gathering was formal and didn't allow spouses, or it was a casual dinner she might find dull. Jane trusted him, assuming he preferred to keep their relationship private rather than publicizing it. After all, she loved their quiet life together and didn't see the need for grand displays. But even as she rationalized Mark's choices, Jane couldn't completely ignore the growing doubt in the back of her mind. Mark rarely mentioned her to his colleagues or friends, and she started to wonder if he was deliberately keeping their life together separate from his professional one. Mark, for his part, wrestled with his guilt. He justified his actions by telling himself that he was protecting Jane from unnecessary scrutiny. He convinced himself that their love was better off shielded from the judgmental eyes of the world. But deep down, he knew the real issue lay with him. He was ashamed of his inability to rise above his insecurities. As the months passed, the foundation of their relationship began to show cracks. Jane loved Mark deeply and cherished the life they were building together, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Mark, too, felt the weight of his own choices but lacked the courage to address them. Their love remained strong, but the unspoken tension between them hinted at challenges that neither had fully acknowledged. Mark and Jane's life together seemed perfect to anyone on the outside. They had a peaceful routine, filled with cozy dinners, long conversations, and shared laughter that brought warmth to their home. Jane took care of every detail of their house with love, decorating it with personal touches that reflected her vibrant personality. Mark, though often consumed by work, made efforts to show his appreciation for her, bringing her flowers or complimenting her cooking. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks in their seemingly idyllic life were beginning to show. Mark avoided social situations where Jane's presence might be expected. He always had a reason: a work dinner that was strictly professional, a formal event where plus ones weren't invited, or casual gatherings he claimed would bore her. Jane trusted him and found his explanations reasonable. At first, his reluctance to involve her in his social life seemed like a sign that he valued their privacy. Jane noticed these excuses started to stack up over time. Mark never brought her to meet his colleagues, and she didn't know much about his friends. Despite this, she tried not to overthink it. She believed in their love and assumed his choices were driven by a desire to protect what they had, not to hide it. She didn't want to come across as clingy or suspicious. Mark was so affectionate and attentive at home that doubting his intentions felt absurd. But as the months passed, small details began to add up. Mark avoided taking photos with her, though he would share pictures with his friends or co-workers online. He avoided mentioning her name during phone conversations she overheard. Sometimes, Jane caught him quickly changing the subject whenever their marriage came up. These moments planted a seed of doubt. One day, in a light-hearted tone, Jane asked him, "Do your friends even know I exist?" Mark laughed it off, assuring her that they did, but he preferred to keep their relationship private. Jane chose to believe him. She convinced herself that their love didn't need external validation, that what they shared was special because it was just for the two of them. But her trust began to waver. She wondered why he never seemed to want to share their happiness with others. Mark, on the other hand, was drowning in guilt. He knew his behavior was hurting Jane, even if she didn't fully realize it yet. He often found himself justifying his choices internally, telling himself that he was protecting her from the judgment of others. Mark was afraid. The circles he moved in, colleagues, friends, clients, placed a heavy emphasis on appearance and status. He couldn't shake the fear that they might not see Jane as he did, and he hated himself for letting that fear control him. Each time he declined to bring Jane to an event or share their life publicly, he felt the weight of his actions. He lived with the constant fear that one day, his carefully constructed excuses would collapse under the truth. Mark knew he was living two lives. At work, he was the polished, successful businessman who always had everything under control. At home, he was a devoted husband who cherished Jane, but couldn't bring himself to face the judgment he imagined from others. The two versions of himself were drifting further apart, and the effort of keeping them separate was wearing him down. The tension began to seep into their relationship. Jane sensed the growing distance, but couldn't put her finger on what was wrong. She treasured the quiet moments they shared, cooking dinner together, watching movies on the couch, but there was an undercurrent of doubt she couldn't ignore. At times, she felt invisible, not because Mark treated her poorly, but because their love seemed like a secret he didn't want to share with the world. Mark noticed a change in Jane. Her usual spark had dimmed, and her questions about his work or friends carried an unspoken weight. He wanted desperately to confess his fears and apologize for the way he had handled their relationship, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. The thought of exposing his insecurities felt paralyzing. Every time Mark considered being honest with Jane, fear stopped him. He convinced himself that he could fix things without addressing the deeper issues. He told himself that as long as they were happy at home, the outside world didn't matter. But deep down, he knew this wasn't true. He was building a wall between them, brick by brick, and he could feel Jane starting to slip away. For Jane, the cracks in their life together were becoming harder to ignore. She loved Mark deeply, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. As much as she tried to convince herself otherwise, the growing distance between them was undeniable. She began to wonder if their love was enough to bridge the gap that had silently formed between them. Jane had learned to suppress her doubts. Every so often, small signs would appear, but she chose to trust the love she shared with Mark. He was kind, attentive, and always seemed willing to do anything to make her happy. However, the moments of unease began to accumulate, and Jane could no longer ignore them. The turning point came when Jane decided to surprise Mark. He had mentioned a work meeting at a colleague's house, casually giving her the address weeks before. Wanting to do something special, Jane prepared a homemade dinner, one of Mark's favorites, and decided to deliver it to him as a gesture of love and support. She felt excited as she packed the basket, imagining the look on Mark's face when he saw her. But as Jane arrived at the house, her excitement turned into confusion. The street was lined with cars, and lively voices spilled out from the house. It was clearly more than a simple meeting. With the basket in hand, Jane approached the door and knocked. No one answered, so she opened it cautiously and stepped inside. The room was filled with people laughing and talking, the atmosphere vibrant and full of life. In the middle of it all was Mark, holding a glass of wine, surrounded by colleagues, and smiling in a way Jane hadn't seen before. Jane stood frozen for a moment, watching him. He seemed so at ease, so natural in that environment. An environment she had never been invited into. Slowly, she moved closer, weaving through the crowd, until she was close enough for someone to notice her. A woman turned to her with a polite smile and asked who she was. Without hesitation, Jane answered, "I'm Mark's wife." Her words hung in the air. The laughter and conversations around her faded, replaced by an awkward silence. Jane's eyes locked onto Mark as his smile disappeared. He looked stunned, as if he had been caught in a lie. Mark quickly made his way to her, his face betraying his panic. Before Jane could say anything more, he laughed nervously and addressed the group. "Oh, she loves to joke. Always with these funny little comments," he said, his voice forced. Jane's heart sank. She felt the weight of his words as if they were a blow. Around her, some people chuckled awkwardly, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Mark grabbed her arm gently but firmly and led her out of the room before she could respond. Once outside, Mark tried to explain. He told her he hadn't expected her to come, that he was caught off guard, and that he didn't want their personal life to be exposed in such a setting. Jane, still reeling, barely heard him. She only managed to ask one question. "Are you ashamed of me?" Mark's silence was more devastating than any answer he could have given. Jane didn't wait for a reply. She turned and walked away, ignoring his pleas for her to stay. The basket of dinner she had so carefully prepared remained clutched in her hands as she left. When she arrived home, Jane sat on the couch, staring at the basket. Tears welled up in her eyes and fell silently as the full weight of the situation hit her. She felt humiliated and betrayed. For the first time, the excuses Mark had given her over the months, about not attending events together, about keeping their life private, made perfect, painful sense. Mark, left standing outside the house, was filled with regret. He knew he had made a terrible mistake, but he didn't know how to fix it. That night, he tried calling Jane repeatedly, but she didn't answer. He sent message after message, each one more desperate than the last, but her silence remained. For Mark, the night was a blur of guilt and confusion. He replayed the moment over and over in his mind, each time realizing just how deeply he had hurt Jane. He knew he had let fear and pride dictate his actions, and now he was paying the price. Jane, meanwhile, spent the night sorting through her emotions. She felt anger, sadness, and a profound sense of loss, not just for what had happened at the party, but for what it represented. The foundation of trust in her marriage had been shattered. The next morning, when Mark returned home, he found Jane packing a suitcase. She didn't look at him as he walked in, but her movements were deliberate and final. Mark tried to talk to her, to apologize, to explain himself, but Jane didn't want to hear it. She told him she needed time and space to think. She wasn't leaving as a threat or out of spite. She simply couldn't stay in the same house with him without feeling like she was losing herself. Mark stood helplessly as Jane finished packing. When she walked out the door, he felt the weight of his actions crash down on him. As Jane left, Mark was overwhelmed by a sense of emptiness. The house felt like a shell without her presence, and every corner reminded him of the life they had shared and the life he had destroyed. Jane, on the other hand, sought solace at a friend's house. There, she began to process everything that had happened. The betrayal she felt was deep, but she also recognized that this might be a turning point for her. She realized that her pain wasn't just about the party or Mark's words. It was about a pattern of behavior she had accepted for far too long. She had allowed herself to believe that Mark's love was enough to compensate for the cracks in their relationship. Now, she saw that she deserved more. Mark, left to his own thoughts, began to confront the fears and insecurities that had driven him to this point. He realized that his obsession with appearances and his fear of judgment had cost him the one person who truly mattered. And as much as he wanted to fix things, he knew that it wasn't something he could do overnight. For both Mark and Jane, the painful discovery was more than just a moment of betrayal. It was the start of a journey of self-reflection and transformation. The days following Jane's departure were tormenting for Mark. The house, which once felt warm and alive, now felt empty, filled only with silence and memories of everything he had lost. He tried to reach out to Jane, but his calls and messages went unanswered. Every failed attempt pulled him deeper into guilt and regret. Mark constantly called and sent messages, but every unanswered ring served as a reminder of the damage he had caused. He didn't know how to move forward without Jane, and more than that, he didn't know how to deal with the weight of his own choices. He blamed himself for everything, but he had never imagined his wrong decisions would lead him to lose the person he loved most. Meanwhile, Jane was trying to find herself again, staying at a close friend's house. She spent her days in silence, reflecting on everything that had happened. She felt betrayed, but above all, she realized she needed to rediscover who she was outside of the relationship. She loved Mark, but what had happened made her see that love, no matter how deep, wasn't enough. Jane recognized that she had accepted less than she deserved for far too long. She had always known it deep down, but convinced herself that his love made up for it all. Mark, on the other hand, sank into his guilt. He spent sleepless nights trying to understand where everything had started to go wrong. He stared at the dinner basket Jane had left on the sofa when she walked out, feeling the weight of his choices. Prepared with so much care, that basket symbolized her effort, while he, in a single moment, had destroyed everything. For him, every memory of a happy moment came with the pain of knowing he had ruined it himself. He repeatedly asked himself why he couldn't be honest, why he let fear and pride dictate his actions. Jane, little by little, found comfort in small things. She took walks every morning, listening to music that made her feel good. She spent hours talking to her friend, reorganizing her thoughts and emotions. Over time, she began to realize that, although hurt, she also felt stronger. She recognized that she had always put Mark's needs above her own, constantly worrying about how he felt and what he needed, while neglecting herself. For the first time, she started to think about herself. The feeling was liberating but also frightening. She was rediscovering who she was, but she still missed him. Mark, desperate, decided to write a letter. He knew Jane might never read it, but he needed to express his feelings. In every line, he poured his pain, his regret, and his attempt to explain what he barely understood himself. He admitted he had been a coward, that he had let his fears and pride take over. He knew that nothing he could say would erase what he had done, but he needed her to know that it had never been about her. It was about his own flaws. When Jane received the letter, she stared at the envelope for long minutes before opening it. Mark's words were sincere, but also filled with a pain she didn't know if she could ease. She cried as she read it, not because she wanted to return, but because she understood that he was suffering as much as she was. Even so, Jane didn't feel ready to go back. The wound was still fresh, and she knew she needed to maintain the space she had created in order to continue growing. She understood that Mark was learning something important, but so was she. Returning at that moment would jeopardize everything she had achieved so far. Mark realized that Jane still needed time. He decided to respect her space and began seeking help to confront his fears and insecurities, something he had avoided for years. He knew that if he ever wanted a chance to win her back, he would need to become a better version of himself. A version not controlled by fear, but by genuine love. Jane, in turn, focused on herself. She returned to singing, something that had always made her happy, but that she had set aside. She started recording small videos and sharing her music, surprised by the support and encouraging messages from strangers. For her, rediscovering her voice, not just in singing but in expressing her feelings, was liberating. It was a way to reconnect with herself and feel alive again. As the months passed, Mark and Jane drifted apart physically, but both were on journeys of personal transformation. Mark began to question the social pressures that had trapped him for so long, while Jane found a new strength within herself. He knew he still loved her and always would, but he also knew that if he ever had a chance to win her back, it would take more than words. He would have to prove that he had changed. Jane recognized that, even with all the pain, the period of separation was necessary. Sometimes, losing something was the only way to understand its true value, but that didn't necessarily mean going back. It meant growing, and that was exactly what she had done. Jane turned her focus toward music, a passion she had long neglected. Singing had always brought her joy, but she had never allowed herself to explore it seriously. With time and space now available to her, she began singing more often, channeling her emotions through melodies. One morning, as Jane sang casually in the living room, her friend suggested she record herself. At first, Jane was hesitant. The idea of sharing something so personal felt daunting. But after much encouragement, she decided to give it a try. With her phone propped up on an improvised stand, Jane recorded her first song. Her voice was powerful, yet filled with raw emotion. She chose a song about overcoming hardships, something that mirrored her own journey. When Jane posted the video, she had no expectations. It was simply an experiment, a way to occupy her mind. To her surprise, the views started to climb steadily. Supportive comments poured in, with strangers praising not only her voice but the depth of emotion she conveyed. Some wrote that her music had touched them deeply. This small initial success gave Jane a wave of confidence she hadn't felt in a long time. She continued recording videos, each one more daring and personal than the last. Her following grew, and with it, the realization that she had found something that was entirely her own. Singing became more than a form of expression. It was a form of healing. With every note, it felt as though she was piecing herself back together. Meanwhile, Mark observed her journey from afar. He had stumbled upon her videos by chance while scrolling through the internet. Watching Jane sing broke something inside him. She seemed so strong, so full of life, as if she were transforming into someone entirely new. He felt immense pride, but also a deep sadness for no longer being part of her world. Mark knew what he was seeing in the videos was a result of a strength he had underestimated. Jane was blossoming despite everything that had happened. He spent nights replaying her videos, questioning how he had let fear and selfishness drive them apart. Jane, however, had no idea that Mark was watching. For her, this was a personal moment, something that had nothing to do with him. The songs she chose to sing weren't about Mark specifically, but they often reflected the emotions she needed to process. With each performance, she felt she was taking another step toward emotional independence. As the months went by, Jane's reach expanded. She was invited to local events where she began singing for small audiences. These gatherings became not just a stage for her music, but also a platform for her story. Between songs, Jane shared pieces of her journey, how she had learned to value herself, overcome pain, and find power in self-love. Audiences resonated deeply with her words. People of all ages would approach her after performances, thanking her for her vulnerability and saying she had inspired them. Jane began to realize that her music had the power to transform not just her own life, but also the lives of others. While Jane grew stronger, Mark faced his own inner struggles. He had started therapy, something he had always avoided for fear of appearing weak. Through these sessions, he confronted difficult truths about himself. He came to understand that he had spent much of his life trying to meet the expectations of others, sacrificing authenticity and what truly mattered. Mark realized that his fear of judgment wasn't just about Jane. It was about himself, about insecurities he had carried since childhood. He saw that his actions had less to do with how others might perceive Jane, and more to do with how he perceived himself. This realization devastated him, but also gave him clarity about the changes he needed to make. The distance between Mark and Jane grew with each passing day, but in many ways, it helped them both grow. While Jane flourished, Mark faced the broken pieces of his identity. He knew he still loved her, and likely always would. But he also knew he couldn't pursue her again until he had become a better version of himself. Jane, on the other hand, was learning to live fully without him. The pain lingered, but was now accompanied by a strength she had never known. The stage, the applause, the messages of support, all of it reinforced the idea that she was more than enough on her own. When Jane received an invitation to perform at a larger event, she accepted without hesitation. On that stage, she saw her truest reflection, a woman who had faced pain, abandonment, and doubt yet had found a way to rise above it all. In that moment, she knew she had changed forever. Mark watched the event online, without Jane knowing. As he saw her perform, brimming with confidence, he finally understood how much he had underestimated her. It wasn't Jane who needed the world. It was the world that needed her. And as he watched her sing, he made a silent promise to himself. If he ever had another chance with Jane, it would be as a different man, a man worthy of the love she had always given him. Months had passed since Jane and Mark separated. Their lives had changed in ways neither of them could have imagined. Jane, now a respected local artist, continued to grow in her journey of self-discovery and personal fulfillment. Mark, meanwhile, was in the midst of an internal reconstruction, striving to become a truer, braver version of himself, someone who could finally own his choices. Jane focused on her music and the message behind it. Every performance was more than just a show. It was an opportunity to connect with people and share her story. She had learned that vulnerability was her greatest strength, and it created a deep bond with her audience. Despite her progress, there were moments when she thought of Mark, not with sadness or regret, but as part of a chapter that, while painful, had helped her grow. Mark, on the other hand, felt a persistent emptiness. Despite his therapy sessions and the progress he was making, he couldn't ignore the love he still felt for Jane. He knew he had no right to intrude on her life, but he followed her from afar, watching videos of her performances and reading accounts of the impact she had on others. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Jane participated in an outdoor community event, their paths finally crossed again. She was preparing to take the stage when she spotted a familiar face in the crowd. It was Mark, standing at the back, hands in his pockets, with a nervous yet admiring expression. Jane hesitated for a moment. Part of her wanted to pretend she hadn't seen him, but another part felt that this encounter was inevitable. She took to the stage and let her music speak for her. She chose a song about transformation, about how pain can lead to growth. With every verse, she felt her strength resonate in each word.
Every scar, every tear, every fall built a bridge to where I stand tall. Through the shadows, I found my light. In the quiet, I won my fight. They said I'd break, they said I'd bend, but I found strength at every end. Every step, every voice, every hand, I've built a life where I can stand.
Mark stood frozen as he listened. Every note seemed charged with meaning, as if Jane were singing directly to him. He knew she hadn't asked him to be there, that this was her journey, not his. Still, something compelled him to stay, as if the moment were pivotal. When Jane finished her performance, the crowd gave her a standing ovation. She quickly thanked them and began to step down from the stage. But as she descended, she noticed Mark had moved closer, standing in plain sight, seemingly waiting for an opportunity to speak. With a sigh, Jane decided she couldn't avoid the conversation any longer. They met under a tree, away from the commotion of the event. Mark was the first to speak. He began with a simple hi, but the word carried the weight of months of silence between them. Jane acknowledged him with a slight nod, letting him continue. Mark took a deep breath before beginning. He spoke about what he had learned during their time apart, about how he had faced his fears and come to understand the reasons behind his actions. He apologized, but not like before. This time, his words came from a place of genuine understanding, not desperation or hollow regret. Jane listened intently. She could tell he was different, calmer, more grounded. But that didn't change what she had gained on her own. When Mark finished, there was a long silence before Jane finally responded. She thanked him for his words, acknowledging the effort he had made to change. But she was honest about how important her time apart had been for her self-discovery. She explained that, while she still cared for him, her priority now was her own journey, something she couldn't compromise. Mark accepted her words with a slight nod. He knew he couldn't ask for more. The conversation, though brief, gave them both a sense of closure. It wasn't the ending Mark had imagined, but he understood it was what needed to happen. As Jane returned to the event, she felt a lightness she hadn't expected. That encounter, which could have been painful, had instead become a reaffirmation of everything she had achieved. Mark, in turn, felt a mix of sadness and gratitude. He knew he had lost Jane, but he also knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Jane had taken the stage at a prestigious benefit event. The theme of the evening, overcoming and resilience, aligned perfectly with her journey. This was more than a performance. It was an opportunity to share the story of how she turned her struggles into strength. As she prepared to step into the spotlight, Jane reflected on how far she had come. Here was a woman who had once believed her pain needed to be hidden, now standing proudly, ready to use her experiences as a source of inspiration. When the lights illuminated the auditorium and silence spread across the audience, Jane began. She spoke about the years she spent feeling like she was never enough. She described how she had tried to conform to expectations and standards that would never fully accept her. Her voice, steady yet emotional, carried through the room as she detailed the weight of self-criticism and the pain of invisibility. Mark, watching from home, was unprepared for what he saw on screen. He hadn't known Jane would be one of the evening's featured performers. When her image appeared, he froze. Her presence on stage was powerful, and even through the television, her words came through with clarity and impact. Jane recounted how the end of her relationship had been a breaking point, but also a starting point. It was the moment she realized that the validation she sought from others had to come from within. Mark felt a mixture of pride and pain as the camera captured Jane's strength. Her voice resonated, not just with him, but with everyone watching. She explained that pain doesn't define a person. It's what we choose to do afterward that shapes who we are. Her words, even as relayed by the event's narrator, struck a chord. The auditorium remained silent, captivated by Jane's vulnerability and authenticity. The narrator described the audience as spellbound. People of all ages leaning forward in their seats, hanging on every word. Jane wasn't just telling her story. She was tapping into something universal. She spoke about self-acceptance and the power of embracing one's worth. Mark couldn't look away as the narrator emphasized Jane's encouragement to the audience to see their value beyond external opinions. Her message was simple yet profound. As Jane began to sing, her voice filled the space. The narrator highlighted how her song seemed to encapsulate the weight of her journey. The lyrics spoke of falling and rising again, of finding light where there was once only darkness. Mark felt tears welling in his eyes. He knew that the song wasn't just a reflection of her own story, but an invitation for others to reconsider their own. When Jane finished her song, the audience erupted into applause, rising to their feet. The narrator described the standing ovation as a testament to the connection Jane had forged with everyone in the room. She had shared a part of herself, and in doing so, she had touched countless lives. Mark sat in silence after the broadcast ended. He understood that Jane had achieved something he could never have imagined. She had transformed her pain into a force of immense power, one that inspired others in ways he could barely comprehend. As the event's narrator closed the transmission, their final words echoed in Mark's mind. Tonight, Jane showed that resilience isn't just about surviving. It's about transforming. That night, Jane didn't just reaffirm her journey. She became a symbol of strength and transformation for everyone who heard her voice. Jane was at the peak of her career. Her shows sold out, her songs were sung in unison by thousands, and her social media presence inspired countless people. Despite all the attention, Jane remained true to herself. She used her platform to discuss important issues, openly sharing her struggles and triumphs. In one of her most recent posts, Jane decided to address a painful chapter of her life. Without naming names, she wrote about how, in her first marriage, she had been sidelined because her husband was ashamed of her weight. Jane explained how deeply that had hurt her, but also how it became the catalyst for her transformation. For years, I believed my worth depended on how others saw me, she wrote. It was a long and painful journey to realize I deserve respect, love, and admiration, not because I fit a mold, but because I am me. No one should ever feel invisible in the relationship they choose to live. The post went viral almost instantly. People commented, sharing similar stories and thanking Jane for her vulnerability. Among the many who read Jane's words was someone for whom the message resonated deeply, Mark. As Mark finished reading, he felt a tightness in his chest. He knew Jane was talking about him. Although she hadn't mentioned him directly, he recognized the truth in every word. As painful as it was, he couldn't escape the reality that he had been the man who made her feel invisible. Mark spent days thinking about what to do. He didn't want to appear opportunistic or intrusive, but he felt he needed to speak to her, not to undo the past, but to admit the truth. With hesitation, he sent her a message. "I read your post," he began. "I'd like to talk, if you're willing. I don't want to interfere in your life, but I think I owe you an apology I may never have properly given." Jane hesitated before responding. Although she had found peace in her journey, Mark's message brought back feelings she thought she had resolved. After some reflection, she decided that having a conversation didn't mean giving up what she had gained. They arranged to meet at a discreet cafe. When Jane arrived, she found Mark already seated, visibly nervous. He stood as she approached, offering a tentative smile. Jane sat down calmly, waiting for him to begin. "First, thank you for agreeing to meet me," Mark said, his hands gripping the cup in front of him. "I read what you wrote, and every word hit me like a punch. I need to say something I should have said a long time ago." Mark paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I was an idiot. There's no other way to put it. I was never ashamed of you, Jane. Never. You were, and still are, beautiful. The problem wasn't you. It was me. I was trapped in standards imposed by society, by my family, by my friends. I wanted to fit in, to be accepted, and I ended up making you feel unworthy when, in reality, you were always more than I deserved." Jane listened intently, her emotions fluctuating between surprise and disbelief. She could tell he was sincere, but the scars of the past still stung. "And now," she asked calmly, "now that I'm famous, you decide it's time to say this? What's changed?" Mark shook his head quickly. "It's not that, I swear. It's not because of your fame. It's because I realized what I lost. I've spent years reflecting on this, trying to understand how I could have been so blind. You've always been amazing, Jane, but I was too small-minded to see it. I don't want anything from you other than the chance to show you that I've learned from my mistakes." Jane felt his words as a mixture of truth and genuine regret. Still, she knew that trusting again wouldn't be simple. "Do you expect me to forget everything? To just make space for you again? It's not that easy, Mark." "I know," he replied, his eyes locked on hers. "I'm not asking you to trust me now. I'm asking for a chance to prove I'm different, that I've grown. I understand if you can never forgive me, but I needed you to know how much I regret it, and how much I admire who you've become." There was a long silence between them. Jane looked at Mark, searching for signs of honesty. The man sitting across from her seemed different from the one she remembered. "Mark," she began, her voice soft but firm, "I appreciate your words, but right now, my focus is on myself. I don't know if I can open that space for you again." He nodded, respecting her decision. "I understand, but know that I'll be here, willing to prove I'm worthy of your trust, if you ever decide to give me that chance." With that, the conversation ended. Jane left the cafe feeling a mix of emotions. Mark seemed sincere, but the wounds of the past were still present. She knew that the most important thing was to maintain her self-respect and stay focused on her journey. Mark walked away with a mix of sadness and hope. He knew there were no guarantees, but for the first time, he felt he had done something right by acknowledging his mistakes. Their story remained unresolved, but more than an ending, they had both found a greater truth: the value of self-respect. So, what would you do if you were in Jane's place? Is it possible to forgive a great love that hurt you so much in the past? Or should self-respect always come first? This emotional story leaves us reflecting on the value of self-love and second chances. Leave your comment below. We want to know your opinion. And don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our emotional stories full of twists and turns. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message of strength and resilience. See you in the next amazing story.